Hello, and welcome to Chapter 5, the next lecture for PBH435 Health Studies of Dangerous Drugs. Today we're going to be looking at the actions of drugs, looking into a little bit more specifically the kinds and categories of drugs that we'll be working with this semester. So our goals for today are to understand why so many drugs that we use and abuse today come from plants and the origins of human use of these substances. We're going to talk about how to distinguish among generic, brand, and chemical names for drugs. And then we're going to look at our 6 major drug categories. We'll spend a little time talking about placebos and the placebo effect. And then we'll look at some specifics about drug analysis for potency, dose response, ED50, and LD50. And then finally, we'll take a look at the blood-brain barrier. So let's start with sources of drugs. Many drugs that we use today are chemically derived from plants. We discussed in one of our early classes how if you were a resident of North America several millennia ago and you had a headache, you'd probably find a branch of a willow tree to chew on. And that would you'd actually probably find that would relieve your headache because the willow branch would contain the same compound that we now call aspirin. So when we think about why it is that plants produce so many psychoactive drugs, really plants would only produce substances for 2 reasons. The first one is as a defense mechanism, and the second is as a survival mechanism. So a defense mechanism might be a way to stop animals from eating it, and a survival mechanism would probably be a way to make sure that the plants seeds or fruit were born as far away as possible. And as we continue to look at drugs throughout the course of the semester, we'll realize that very few of them were actually synthesized in a lab by a human, and many actually begin in nature as a plant substance that's then further refined throughout the history of the drug. So we'll see that pattern over and over and over again. So when we think about why it is that people started consuming drugs, a good way to think about this is just starting with basic human needs, things like heat, food, and water. So if we think about fire as a really important cultural phenomenon in early human history, what do you think would happen if humans at the time were sitting around a fire and cannabis or tobacco was put on the campfire? People would start to learn what would happen next and whether they liked the effects or didn't like the effects. If we think about food, if you were living in early human history, chances are there were times when you really needed to be able to put forth a serious amount of physical effort in order to survive. And what if you were on a hunt and you needed something to eat and you grabbed some leaves, some coca leaves to chew on, and you realized that your energy level went up and that you were maybe able to hunt more successfully, bring back more food for your tribe or your civilization or your family. And people would start to realize that those kinds of foods were contributed to their success. We talk about water. The fermentation process, in addition to adding alcohol, it very effectively removes microorganisms from that water. So it's a sterilizing process as well. And people who drank water that had been through that fermentation process were less likely to encounter waterborne illnesses. So if we think about ways that drugs of use and abuse enter human society, it's pretty regular that they occur as part of filling a basic human need. So it's probably unlikely that the first person who chewed on coca leaves knew exactly what they were going to do, but it is a pattern that we see. That's something that's found naturally occurring at a low level that might have something to do with the plant's desire or ability to survive, ends up having this dramatic effect on human society. So let's talk a little bit more about the names of drugs. Drugs are known, most drugs, by at least 3 different names. We've got the chemical name, the generic name, and then the brand name. So the chemical name, this is one that most of us can't pronounce, and very few of us actually call the drugs that we're using by these names, but some of the names that we use are derived from these chemical names. Then we've got the generic name. A good example of this would be, not Advil or Motrin, but ibuprofen, if we're talking about over-the-counter drugs. So if we talk about ibuprofen, we're talking about that NSAID that goes by several different trade names, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. So the brand names that we know ibuprofen by, they include Advil and Motrin. So this is a specific drug or formulation of the drug that's been trademarked by a manufacturer. And they're able to keep that trademark for 20 years. So the examples on the slide here are for the prescription drug Provigil. We've got the generic name of modafinil, and then the chemical name, which I'll have you read. So we can see how an individual drug is known by at least 3 different names, and then often for drugs of abuse, we see a long list of street names that the drug is known by as well. Next, we're going to look at the different categories of drugs, and these will break down into categories that we'll cover over the course of this semester. I've got stimulants, depressants, opioids, hallucinogens, psychotherapeutics, and then this catch-all category of other. Stimulants, this is pretty straightforward, help us feel more awake, give us a better sense of energy. Everything from caffeine to cocaine would fit into this category. Depressants have the opposite effect. Depressants are going to slow down nervous system activity. Alcohol is considered as a depressant, and it's one that is the most commonly used in the United States. Opioids or narcotics, their major function is to reduce pain, and this would include prescription opioids as well as drugs like opium and heroin. Hallucinogens, these drugs produce an altered type of perception. LSD is the one that most people are familiar with here. And then psychotherapeutics, or drugs that were developed to treat symptoms of mental disorders. And then finally, our other category. The 2 drugs that fit best here that we'll talk about this semester are marijuana and nicotine. And basically that's because they combine multiple categories or function in different ways within these single drugs.